This is my author study project. My subject is Paul Laurence Dunbar. The works discussed today will be Paul Dunbar and the Mask of Dialects by John Keeling, Literary Subterfuge, Early African American Critique, and The Trope of the Mask by Daniel P. Black, Racial Segregation and Southern Lynching by Lisa D., Trevon D. Logan, and John M. Parman. My first topic is post-Civil War segregation. Firstly, something discussed is to discuss is Southern lynching. The author argues that segregation resulted in black lynchings and not white, further arguing that segregation influenced violence through racial isolation rather than general violence in segregated communities. According to the source, lynching would happen in order for the whites to remain dominant in the economy. Also, it argued that lynching occurred in more segregated areas, as the chart below shows this. Lynching was the act of hanging someone with or without legal reason, and it occurred often in the post-segregation era, according to this source. In fact, it was so significant that Dunbar wrote about it in his story, The Lynching of Jude Benson. Furthermore, the li furthermore, sources, literary subterfuge, early African American writing, and the trope of the mask, and Dunbar and the Mask of Dialect discuss ways that Dunbar navigates around the segregation in order to succeed. One way he navigated was through his dialect. The dialect poetry, often categorized in the plantation tradition, was viewed by some critics as pondering to stereotypes, while his more serious standard English poetry struggled to find an audience. Daniel Black even says in his writing, "Was it simply by we?" Dunbar could have been referencing not only black people, but also black writers specifically. If read this way, the poem announces the mask as a group as the guiding trope of African American literature. This means the mask was Dunbar's way of appealing to the white marketplace and succeeding. Moreover, the significance of dialect was shown through the sources literary subverge, early African American writing, and the trope of the mask, and Paul Dunbar and the Mask of Dialect to be much more than just a way of around segregation. Literary subverge, early African American writing, and the trope of the mask discusses dialect as a way to mask their true feelings and critiques of white supremacy in order to avoid rejection of white audiences and publishers, but also to avoid direct confrontation with oppressive powers while still making powerful statements. This leads to the discussion of the mask, which we discussed commonly in class through the readings and through the readings, how it was being the way whites expected that commonly blacks had to do in order to that blacks had to act in order to be accepted in a white dominant community. Dunbar even wrote about the mask in his poem, We Wear the Mask. One can argue that in all of Dunbar's poems using African American dialect, he is wearing a mask. But instead of labeling all blacks as wearing a mask, Daniel Black more specifically lists it as a way for black writers to succeed. And Paul Dunbar and the Mask of Dialect, Keeling suggests the same idea of a mask through dialect. However, he expresses the idea that Dunbar's usage of dialect is not only a mask, but something that speaks to contradictions and frustrations as both an felt as both an artist and a member of the African American community in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Keeling even goes deeper into the mask subject by saying that Dunbar uses humor in some of his writings and that the humor masks a deeper sense of desperation and or frustration. Keeling also opposes this mask of dialect proposed by himself and Black when he says, to say that these poems are not all masked and to suggest that they exploit rather than subvert the stereotypical notions of African American character and speech that existed in Dunbar's culture. This suggests that the usage of dialect is rather an exploit than something used to break barriers of segregation by sending messages. This exploit would be the usage of dialect allows Dunbar to thrive in a white dominated literary marketplace. However, in a broader sense, hewing symbolizes dialect as misunderstanding, social expectations, and cultural resistance. All of these arguments are similar to the topic of the mask that we discussed in class with Du Bois and Dunbar when it came to connecting the topic of the mask as something that African Americans were almost forced to come to and need to wear to succeed. Something that John Keeling and Paul Dunbar and the Mask of Dialect mentioned was that there was irony within some of Dunbar's writings. This roots in the fact that he argues that Dunbar's perspective differs from the narrator's writings. And an example of this that we read in class was the lynching of Jude Benson, where the narrator is the one who hung the black man, but Dunbar makes it but Dunbar does not agree with it due to the fact that his perspective in other writings can make an inference to this. And we can assume that this writing style was used to appeal to a white audience who would um who would find interest in these kinds of writings where whites are dominant. Keeling overall argues that this ironic discrepancy between the speaker's surface message and the hidden complexities within the text allows the reader to see past the mask and recognize deeper meanings. Much like how Dunbar's characters might mask their true feelings behind their outward expressions. Furthermore, the topic of channeling one message that appeals to whites and a hidden message that appeals to blacks is ironic. In fact, Daniel Black supports this as in his stories, the central argument of the piece is that the use of dialect and humor allow these writers to sneak subversive messages past their readers. For instance, Dunbar's use of dialect in his poetry, such as in what Black uses as an example, is when Malindi sings may appear comical or folkloric on the surface, but beneath this mask is a powerful message that elevates Black cultural pride and subtly critiques white supremacy. Audience. There is a seemingly respectful tone toward our white audience, while also subtly critiquing them. Overall, after reading and analyzing these sources and connecting them to stories, it can be connected to the world today still. In fact, racial segregation and Southern lynching argues that the facts of lynching still make an impact nowadays and that the segregated areas still remain. The article argues that segregation was not only a symptom of racial inequality, but also an active force that contributed to racial violence, creating long-lasting social and economic effects in the South. Furthermore, the Southern writing style and literary marketplace has gone through changes nowadays, as many Black authors find success without having to change dialect to appeal to white readers.